The old Victorian house, with its peeling paint and overgrown ivy, seemed to sag under the weight of its secrets. Built on the edge of a sleepy, forgotten town nestled amongst the rolling hills of Vermont, it stood as a testament to a bygone era, a time when things were simpler, or so they said. The house, a rambling structure with gables and turrets, was a labyrinth of dimly lit hallways, dusty rooms with faded floral wallpaper, and creaking floorboards that whispered with every step. The air, thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten memories, hung heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, guarding the secrets within its walls. My grandfather, a man weathered and worn like the house itself, barely spoke a word. His silence as oppressive as the humid summer air that clung to everything in that town. A silence that had become a constant companion, a shroud that enveloped him. He was a statue in a worn armchair, his eyes permanently fixed on the flickering television screen, the only sound a grunt of approval when a golfer sank a putt, a rare crack in the facade of indifference he presented to the world. My mother, ever the optimist, with her sunny disposition and infectious laughter, called him selective with his words. I, however, knew him for what he was, a grumpy old recluse, a man who had built walls around himself thicker than the ivy that choked the house, walls that no amount of sunshine could penetrate. He'd always been this way, a silent monolith in my life, a figure shrouded in mystery and melancholy. Even as a child, my attempts to engage him were met with indifference, a polite dismissal that stung more than outright anger. I remember twirling in my frilly dresses, a giggling whirlwind of energy, my laughter echoing through the cavernous living room, filled with antique furniture shrouded in dust sheets and the scent of mothballs. "Grandpa, look!" I'd plead, my voice echoing in the emptiness, my small hand tugging at his sleeve, hoping to capture his attention, to elicit a smile, a word of encouragement. He'd merely rustle the paper, his newspaper a shield against the world, a dismissive gesture that sent me scurrying back to the comforting embrace of my grandmother, the only source of warmth in that cold, imposing house, a house that felt more like a museum than a home. Grandma was the heart of the house, her warmth a stark contrast to my grandfather's icy demeanor. She was the one who baked me cookies shaped like animals, her kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of vanilla and cinnamon, who bandaged my scraped knees after I tumbled from the ancient oak tree in the overgrown garden, its branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled fingers, and applauded my clumsy attempts at cartwheels on the threadbare carpet in the hallway, her laughter echoing through the house like music. Her death the previous spring had left a gaping hole in my life, a silence that mirrored my grandfather's own. Only hers was a silence born of absence, his of choice, a deliberate retreat from the world and the pain it held. It was in the wake of her passing that my mother, bless her meddling heart, concocted the granddaughter-grandfather bonding extravaganza. With the enthusiasm of a game show host, she packed my bags, filled with summer dresses and books I knew I wouldn't read, and shipped me off to my grandfather's for 2 weeks, a sentence to solitary confinement in the House of Silence. She, meanwhile, embarked on a whirlwind honeymoon with her new husband, a man whose booming laughter and jovial personality seemed completely out of place in the somber atmosphere of our family, a jarring contrast to the quiet grief that had settled over us. At 15, I was perfectly capable of fending for myself, of spending my days reading and exploring the woods that bordered our property, a haven of whispering pines and hidden streams where I could escape the stifling atmosphere of the house. But my mother, ever hopeful, saw this as an opportunity to forge a connection that had been absent my entire life, a bridge across the chasm of my grandfather's silence, a chance to heal the wounds that ran deep in our family. "You'll have a wonderful time, darling," she chirped, her voice overly bright, a forced cheerfulness that grated on my nerves. practically shoving me out of the car and into the gloomy embrace of the old house. I could smell the dampness, the mustiness of a place closed off from the world, a place where time seemed to stand still, and hear the floorboards groan under the weight of forgotten years, each creak a lament for lost joy. "But he doesn't even talk," I protested, my voice laced with teenage angst and the frustration of being deposited in what felt like a mausoleum, a place where laughter and conversation had died long ago. "He does," she insisted, her eyes twinkling with an optimism I didn't share, an unwavering belief in the goodness of her father that I found hard to understand. "You just have to listen." And with a final wave and a chirp of tires on the gravel driveway, she was gone, leaving me stranded on the shores of my grandfather's silence, a vast and lonely landscape. The first week was a symphony of silence, punctuated only by the clatter of dishes and the creaking of the old house settling in the summer heat. The days stretched out endlessly, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant barking of a dog. We moved around each other like ghosts, our interactions limited to grunts and nods, a silent dance of avoidance and discomfort. He ate his meals in front of the TV, his plate balanced precariously on his knee, his eyes glued to the screen as if it held the secrets of the universe, a refuge from the memories that haunted him. I retreated to the solitude of the guest room, with its faded floral wallpaper and heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the sun, creating a twilight world where I could hide from the oppressive silence of the house. My meals were a lonely affair, consumed on a tray while I stared out at the overgrown garden, imagining the ghosts of laughter and games that had once echoed there, the vibrant life that had been extinguished by grief and secrets. Then, one stifling night, the air thick with the threat of a thunderstorm, the wind howling through the trees like a banshee, I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The house was eerily silent, the usual creaks and groans silenced by the impending storm. The only sound, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Each tick a hammer blow against the silence, a constant reminder of the passage of time, of the years wasted in silence and regret. A sliver of light spilled from under my grandfather's door, a beacon in the oppressive darkness, a crack in the armor of his isolation. Curiosity piqued. I crept towards it, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet, the floorboards groaning beneath me like a warning, as if the house itself was trying to dissuade me from uncovering its secrets. The door was slightly ajar, and I peered inside. My grandfather sat in his armchair, a glass of amber liquid clutched in his hand, the ice clinking softly, a lonely sound in the quiet room. His face, illuminated by the dim glow of a bedside lamp, was etched with lines of sorrow, the weight of years and unspoken grief evident in every crease. His eyes, usually cold and distant, were red-rimmed and filled with a deep sorrow, a vulnerability I had never seen before, a glimpse of the man hidden beneath the layers of silence and pain. He was staring at the air vent, his gaze fixed on it as if it held the answers to life's mysteries, a portal to a past he couldn't escape, a past that haunted his every waking moment. "I wish you were still here," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, the words barely audible above the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen, a constant reminder of the life that had been lived and lost in this house. I hesitated, unsure whether to intrude on his private grief, this crack in the armor he had worn for so long, this rare moment of vulnerability. But something in his voice, a plea for connection, for understanding, drew me in. "Who do you wish was here?" I asked softly, stepping into the room, the floorboards betraying my presence with a loud creak that shattered the fragile silence. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening in surprise, then a flicker of recognition, of something akin to welcome, crossed his face. He beckoned me closer, his hand trembling slightly. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding, a mixture of fear and anticipation swirling within me. We had never been this close, this intimate. He wordlessly offered me the glass, and I took a hesitant sip. The scotch burned my throat, a fiery liquid that mirrored the turmoil in his eyes, the unspoken grief that had haunted him for years, a fire that refused to be extinguished. "It's time you knew about my sister," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, the words heavy with the weight of years, the weight of a secret that had been buried for too long. And so, in the stillness of that humid night, with the storm brewing outside and the house creaking around us, he began his story, a tale woven with threads of guilt, regret, and a long-buried secret, a story that would forever change the way I saw my grandfather and the house that held us captive. "I know you don't think much of me," he began, his voice raspy, each word an effort, a breaking of the dam that had held back his emotions for so long. "Truth be told, I don't think much of myself either. There are things I do differently, choices I regret, moments I wish I could erase from my memory. You're young, but one day you'll understand the weight of those regrets, the way they cling to you like shadows, how they haunt your dreams and poison your waking moments. This house," he gestured around the room, with its faded grandeur and lingering scent of decay, a monument to a family's slow decline, has been in our family for generations. It was built by my great-grandfather, a stern and imposing man who had made his fortune in the timber industry, a man who ruled his family with an iron fist. When I was a boy, just a few years older than you, it felt like a castle, a place of endless possibilities and hidden adventures. This very room, with its high ceilings and dusty chandeliers, was my kingdom. I'd spend hours playing with my toy soldiers, their painted faces frozen in expressions of bravery and determination, imagining epic battles and heroic deeds, lost in a world of my own making, a world where I was the hero, the savior, the one who always did the right thing. "My mother," he continued, his voice softening, a hint of warmth creeping into his tone, "was a kind and gentle woman, a beacon of light in the often stifling atmosphere of our home. She filled the house with warmth and laughter, her presence a bright spot in the often gloomy days. She was a talented artist, her paintings adorning the walls, capturing the beauty of the surrounding countryside, the vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the drabness of the house itself. But her spirit, her joy, was slowly crushed by the weight of my father's secrets, the darkness that seeped into every corner of our lives. My father, however, was a different story. He was a preacher, a man of God, respected and revered by the community, his every word taken as gospel. His sermons were legendary, his voice booming through the small-town church, its stained glass windows casting multicolored shadows on the faces of the congregation, his words filled with fire and brimstone, his pronouncements on sin and redemption echoing through the hallowed halls. But behind the facade of piety lurked a darkness, a secret that would forever taint our family, a stain that spread like ink through the generations, poisoning our lives with shame and guilt. From a young age, I was taught to obey, to trust my parents implicitly. Blind faith, they called it, a surrender to a higher power, a relinquishing of personal responsibility. So when my father told me to ignore the strange noises coming from the attic, the muffled cries and the unsettling thuds that punctuated the night, I did. I'd lie in bed at night, listening to the sounds, my heart pounding with fear, my imagination conjuring up images of monsters and ghosts, my mind a battlefield of terror and confusion. My father dismissed them as just the rats, but I knew deep down, in the pit of my stomach, that something was amiss, something hidden away in the dusty recesses of the attic, something that my parents were desperate to keep secret. One night, I was playing in my room, lost in my world of knights and dragons, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls, transforming familiar objects into menacing shapes, when I heard a voice, faint and muffled, coming from the air vent. "Hello?" it called, a small, hesitant voice, like a bird trapped in a cage, a cry for help that pierced the silence of my lonely world. I froze, my blood turning to ice, my breath catching in my throat. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling, the toy sword slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor, the sound amplified in the sudden stillness. "I, Polly," the voice replied. "I live in the attic." It was a girl's voice, small and childlike, filled with a loneliness that resonated with my own, a kindred spirit trapped in the darkness. Intrigued and terrified, I moved closer to the vent, my heart pounding like a drum, my curiosity battling with my fear. "Are you my brother?" she asked, her voice filled with a longing that tugged at my soul, a yearning for connection that mirrored my own. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, my mind reeling from the implications of her words. "Are you my sister?" "Daddy says I have a brother," she said, her voice filled with a wistful hope, a dream of a sibling, a companion in her lonely world. "But he won't let me see him." "Why not?" I asked, my curiosity overcoming my fear, the need to know outweighing the risk of discovery. "He says there's something wrong with me," she whispered, her voice heavy with shame, the words echoing the prejudice and ignorance of the world outside our walls. "What's wrong with you?" I pressed, needing to know, needing to understand the secret that lurked in the shadows of our house, the truth that my parents had so carefully concealed. "I can't think real good," she admitted, her voice small and filled with sadness, a confession that broke my heart. We talked for what seemed like hours that night, two lonely souls connected by a shared secret, a forbidden bond forged in the darkness, a lifeline in a world of isolation. I learned that Polly was indeed my sister, hidden away in the attic, a prisoner in her own home, a victim of our father's twisted sense of shame, his inability to accept anything less than perfection. The next morning, emboldened by the newfound connection, fueled by a childish sense of justice and a desperate need to share my discovery, I excitedly told my parents about my sister, about Polly, about the voice in the air vent. Their reaction was swift and brutal, a storm of anger and denial that shattered the fragile peace of our breakfast table, the china cups rattling, the silverware clattering to the floor. My father's face contorted with rage, his eyes burning with a fury that made me cower, his voice a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the house. My mother, pale and trembling, averted her gaze, her silence a damning indictment, her complicity in this charade a betrayal that cut deeper than any words. "You don't have a sister," my father thundered, his voice shaking the very foundation of the house, the china rattling in the cupboard, his words a denial of reality, a rejection of his own flesh and blood. "But I do," I protested, tears welling up in my eyes, my voice cracking with the injustice of it all, the unfairness of Polly's imprisonment, the cruelty of their denial. "She lives in the attic." "Lies," he roared, slamming his fist on the table, the force of it sending the silverware flying, the pancakes on my plate splattering with syrup, a metaphor for the chaos that had erupted in our once-ordered world. "You're lying to upset your mother," he accused, his voice dripping with venom, his words a twisted manipulation designed to shift the blame, to silence my protests. I was banished to my room, my heart filled with confusion and anger. How could they deny Polly's existence? How could they keep her locked away like a shameful secret, a dirty stain on their perfect facade, a blemish on their carefully constructed image of piety and righteousness? Later that day, as I sat on my bed, staring out at the rain-soaked garden, the raindrops sliding down the window pane like tears, I heard Polly's voice, small and frightened, coming from the air vent, a fragile whisper that cut through the gloom. "You told Daddy we talked?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear, the echo of my father's anger reverberating in her words. "Yes," I admitted, my voice thick with guilt, the weight of my betrayal crushing me, the realization that my actions had put her in danger. "He's going to be angry," she cried, her voice barely a whimper, a premonition of the violence to come. He might hurt me, and hurt her he did. That night, I lay in bed, my ears straining to hear the sounds from the attic, the muffled voices and the chilling thuds that echoed through the old house, each sound a hammer blow to my heart. I heard my father's angry voice, a venomous whisper that cut through the darkness, his words laced with threats and accusations, and Polly's whimpers, her cries for help swallowed by the storm raging outside, her pleas for mercy lost in the wind. I wanted to scream, to run and help her, to be the brave knight I had pretended to be, to rescue my princess from the clutches of the evil king, but fear paralyzed me, my courage failing me in the face of my father's wrath. I was a coward, hiding under the covers while my sister suffered, my inaction a silent complicity in her fate, a stain on my soul that would never wash away. The next morning, the attic was silent, the storm passed, leaving behind an eerie calm, a silence that spoke volumes. My father, his face pale and drawn, his eyes haunted by a darkness I couldn't comprehend, a darkness that mirrored Raisha, the darkness that had consumed Polly, told me that Polly had been taken away. He spoke of a faraway institution, a place where she would be cared for, where she would be better off. But I knew without a doubt that he had killed her, that her cries had been silenced forever, buried in the cold earth beneath the ancient oak tree in the garden. The years that followed were a blur of guilt and regret. I carried the burden of Polly's death, the weight of my own inaction crushing me, the memory of her cries haunting my dreams. I became withdrawn, silent, a shell of the boy I once was, my laughter silenced, my spirit broken. I retreated into myself, building walls around my heart, shutting out the world and the pain it held. I became the man you know, the silent, grumpy old man who hides from his emotions, from the truth, from the memory of the sister I failed to protect. My grandfather's voice trailed off, the silence in the room heavy with unspoken grief, the weight of his confession hanging in the air, a tangible presence that pressed down on us. He took a long sip of his scotch, his hand trembling slightly, the ice clinking against the glass like a death knell, a reminder of the finality of Polly's fate. "I'm so sorry, Grandpa," I whispered, my heart aching for him, for Polly, for the family they could have been, for the childhood stolen by secrets and lies, for the innocence lost in the shadows of that old house. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a lifetime of pain, the years of silence etched into his face, the lines of regret a roadmap of his suffering. "Don't be," he said, his voice hoarse, the words catching in his throat, a lifetime of suppressed emotions finally finding release. "It was my fault. I should have protected her." We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the distant rumble of thunder, a reminder of the storm that had raged that night, both outside and within the walls of that old house, a storm that had swept away Polly's life, leaving behind a trail of destruction and despair. The house, once a place of shadows and secrets, now felt filled with the presence of Polly, her spirit lingering in the dusty corners and the faded photographs, a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls, a constant reminder of the sister he had failed. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, painting the room in a soft, ethereal light, I felt a strange sense of peace. The silence that had defined my grandfather's life was finally broken. The truth revealed, the weight of his secret lifted, if only slightly, and in that shared moment of grief and understanding, a bond was forged, a connection that transcended the years of silence and regret, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of his pain. He reached out and took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong, his touch conveying a warmth I had never felt from him before. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for listening." I squeezed his hand, my own tears flowing freely now, a release of the pent-up emotions that had been building within me. "I love you, Grandpa," I said, the words echoing in the quiet room, a declaration of acceptance, of forgiveness, of a newfound understanding. He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude, a glimmer of hope shining through the pain. "I love you too, Polly," he replied, using my name, the name he had chosen for me, the name that carried the weight of his regret and his love for the sister he had lost. And in that moment, I knew that we had both found a measure of peace, a sense of closure, a connection that would forever bind us, a shared grief that had finally brought us together. The house, with all its secrets and shadows, no longer seemed so oppressive. The silence no longer so deafening. We had faced the darkness together, and in doing so, we had found a way to let in the light.